Everything was ready for a perfect wedding, but when the priest looked at the bride, he noticed something strange. The atmosphere in the church changed in an instant, and in a few seconds the ceremony turned into a real nightmare. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The old church stood proudly in the heart of the southern town. Its towering steeple cast in long shadows as the afternoon sun streamed through the intricate stained glass windows. The warm hues of red, blue, and gold painted the polished wooden pews where friends and family had gathered in anticipation. A hushed excitement filled the air, murmured conversations and quiet laughter echoing beneath the high arched ceiling. A scent of fresh roses and polished oak lingered, mingling with a faint trace of incense from an earlier service. At the front of the church, the groom stood in a crisp black suit, his hands clasped before him, his face a portrait of quiet composure. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, briefly settling on familiar faces before shifting toward the grand wooden doors at the far end of the aisle. His chest rose with a measured breath, anticipation flickering beneath his carefully controlled expression. He exuded confidence, the kind that came naturally to a man who always knew where he was headed. Beside him, Father Michael adjusted the sleeves of his ceremonial robe, the weight of the moment settling upon him as it did before every wedding. Though he had presided over countless ceremonies in his years, there was always a moment of solemnity before the vows were spoken. Marriage was a binding promise, an intertwining of souls, and it was his duty to witness and sanctify that union. He cast a glance toward the congregation, nodding in quiet acknowledgement of the expectant faces that turned toward him. Then the music began. The first strains of the wedding march drifted through the air, and a collective breath was drawn as the grand doors opened, revealing the bride. She was breathtaking, a vision in white, her gown flowing like liquid silk as she took her first step into the aisle. The fabric shimmered in the light, hugging her figure before cascading in soft folds to the floor. A delicate veil framed her face, its sheer fabric doing little to conceal the striking beauty beneath. Her dark skin glowed under the gentle illumination of the church, the contrast between her complexion and the ivory of her gown making her appear almost ethereal. A hush fell over the room as she moved forward, her steps measured and deliberate, yet something in her posture felt restrained, as though she carried an invisible weight upon her shoulders. She held a bouquet of ivory roses, but her fingers seemed to grip the stems too tightly, knuckles pale with tension. At the back of the church, a lone figure watched her with an intensity that set him apart from the rest of the guests. Her brother sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his gaze never wavering from his sister as she approached the altar. His dark eyes flickered with an emotion that was difficult to define. Concern, perhaps even something deeper, something heavier, while others in the congregation smiled in admiration. His expression remained grim. Father Michael observed everything as he always did. Years of experience had honed his instincts and taught him to read the unspoken cues in people's expressions, the small betrayals of emotion that revealed more than words ever could. And as he watched the bride approach, a whisper of unease stirred within him. The groom stepped forward as she arrived at the altar, reaching for her hands. She hesitated for the briefest moment before placing hers in his. The moment should have been one of joy, of love exchanged in a single touch. Yet Father Michael noticed the subtle tremor in her fingers. It was natural for a bride to be nervous, for weddings were emotional affairs, but something about this felt different. The groom leaned in slightly, whispering something to her, his thumb grazing over the back of her hand in reassurance. She did not respond, instead offering him a fleeting, almost forced smile before turning her gaze to the priest. Father Michael cleared his throat, steadying himself before beginning the ceremony. We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls joined in love and devotion. The words came easily, the familiar cadence of tradition grounding him. Yet as he spoke, his gaze lingered on the bride. Her expression remained composed, but there was a distance in her eyes, a detachment that unsettled him. She blinked slowly, her breathing measured yet shallow, and a sheen of perspiration dotted her forehead, though the church was comfortably cool. He continued guiding the couple through the vows. The groom spoke with certainty, his voice unwavering as he recited his promises, and when it was the bride's turn, there was the slightest hesitation before she repeated the words, her voice soft but steady. Father Michael glanced toward the brother in the back row. The young man's posture had not relaxed. In fact, he seemed even more rigid now, his hands clenched in a fist on his lap, his gaze boring into the groom with an expression that was unreadable but undeniably tense. Then, as the bride reached for the ring, something changed. A small misstep, a slight sway in her posture. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the delicate band, her breath hitched audibly, and for the briefest second her vision seemed to blur. Father Michael's heart quickened. She took a half step forward, and then her body gave out. The gasp that echoed through the church was sharp and collective as the bride crumpled, her knees buckling and her hands slipping from the groom's grasp. In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. The groom dropped to his knees beside her, panic flashing in his eyes as he called her name, while guests surged forward, their voices overlapping in alarm. Reacting on instinct, Father Michael stepped down from the altar and moved swiftly toward her. Her brother was already pushing his way through the pews, his face dark with something deeper than shock. The bride lay motionless, her head resting on the groom's lap, her breathing shallow and uneven, and her bouquet had fallen to the floor with white petals scattered against the stone tiles. Father Michael knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to the side of her neck, feeling a pulse that was weak, too weak, and a sinking feeling settled in his gut as he said, "She needs help," his voice rising over the clamor. Now a guest fumbled for their phone and dialed emergency services. The groom's hands hovered over her face as though afraid to touch her, while her brother reached for her, his breath ragged, his eyes darting over her unconscious form. Then he looked up at the groom for a single moment, and the world seemed to slow. The look that passed between them was not one of shared concern, but of something else entirely, suspicion, its weight settling over the room like a storm gathering on the horizon. As the sirens wailed in the distance and drew closer, Father Michael knew with certainty this was no simple fainting spell. It was something far more sinister. The church, once filled with hushed whispers and soft murmurs of admiration, now resonated with overlapping voices in alarm, a cacophony of concern and confusion as the bride lay unmoving on the floor. The groom's frantic voice broke through the noise, calling her name again and again, his hands trembling as they hovered near her face, afraid to touch her, afraid of what he might find. Guests had risen from their seats, some stepping cautiously forward while others remained frozen, staring in disbelief. A woman near the front covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, while another reached for her husband's arm, gripping it as if she too might collapse from the sudden tension in the air. Father Michael barely heard them, his focus entirely on the bride as he knelt beside her, his fingers pressed against her throat, feeling for a pause. It was there, weak and fluttering, but present. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The way she had swayed before she fell, the way her body had gone completely limp. It wasn't just nerves. Something was very wrong. The groom turned to him, his face pale with fear. "What's happening? What's wrong with her?" Father Michael didn't answer immediately. He glanced up at her brother, who stood rigid over them, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his eyes never leaving his sister. But there was something more in his gaze than fear. It was suspicion. The sirens grew louder, piercing through the heavy silence that had settled over the church, and someone must have called for help immediately, for which Father Michael was grateful, though only minutes remained before the paramedics arrived. The bride's chest rose and fell unevenly, her breathing shallow. Her skin, which had once been warm and rich, now appeared muted and slightly ashen under the glow of the chandeliers. Father Michael frowned, his fingers lightly brushing the back of her hand. Her skin was cool. Not just cool, but slightly clammy, despite the comfortable temperature inside the church. Then he saw it. Her fingers carried a faint bluish tint at the edges just beneath her nails. His breath caught in his throat. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. His mind raced as memories from his early days working at a medical outreach program flooded back. Cases of oxygen deprivation, of poisoning, of bodies shutting down slowly from substances they weren't meant to handle. The signs were all here: the pallor, the sweat, the weak pulse, the unsteady breathing, the blue tint to her extremities. This wasn't just stress or exhaustion. It was something else. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and with a quiet yet firm voice said, "She needs medical attention immediately. Get those doors open for the paramedics." The usher sprang into action, rushing toward the grand wooden doors and pulling them wide, allowing a rush of cooler air to stir the heavy tension that hung over the guests. The groom ran a hand through his hair as panic mounted. "She was fine this morning. I don't understand. Has she been feeling unwell?" Father Michael asked in a calm but firm tone. "Did she say anything about dizziness, nausea, or trouble breathing?" The groom shook his head, though there was hesitation in his expression, as if doubt were creeping in. He turned toward his brother, who was still watching them closely, and in a low, measured voice said, "She didn't say anything, but last night she seemed off." Father Michael's eyes flickered toward him. He noted a subtle twitch in the young man's jaw as he recalled that she had mentioned being tired, having a headache, and wanting to sleep early. The groom then straightened and added, "She told me she was just nervous about today." The brother's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding, and a heavy silence settled between them. Then the paramedics burst through the doors. A team of 3 moved swiftly, carrying equipment and expressions of intense focus as they knelt beside the bride to check her vitals. One paramedic, noticing her oxygen deficiency, pulled out an oxygen mask and gently fitted it over her face, while another took her arm, preparing to insert in 4-line. Father Michael remained alert, observing as the paramedic's hand stilled. He pushed up the sleeve of her gown and noticed a deep bruise, not fresh, but not entirely old either, over the puncture mark on her vein. The paramedic asked, "Has she been given any medication or injections?" The groom's face twisted in confusion as he replied, "No, she's always been healthy. She would have told me." The brother's expression darkened, and in a sharp tone said, "Check the other arm." The paramedic hesitated, then gently lifted the opposite sleeve to reveal another faint bruise from a needle. The groom's breathing hitched as he murmured, "That doesn't make sense." The lead paramedic pulled a small flashlight from his kit, carefully opened her eyes while muttering under his breath. Then in a clipped tone stated, "Pupils are pinpoint. Possible opioid overdose. We need Narcan." The words struck the room like a gunshot, and gasps rippled through the church. The groom reeled back, shaking his head. No, that's not possible. She wouldn't." Father Michael's mouth pressed into a thin line as his mind raced through the implications. This wasn't recreational drug use. The marks on her arms, the signs of poisoning, pointed to something else entirely. As the paramedic administered the antidote, carefully injecting it into her system, seconds passed, then a minute, until the bride's body jerked. Her breath hitched. Her chest rose sharply as air suddenly rushed back into her lungs. Her eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitched, and then she gasped a raw, desperate sound, as if she had been drowning and only now breached the surface. Her eyes flew open wide and filled with confusion, then fear. She blinked rapidly, disoriented, her breathing still shaky. Although the oxygen mask covered the lower half of her face, her eyes told a story. Then she saw the groom. Tears welled in her eyes, and her fingers reached out weakly, gripping Father Michael's sleeve. In a barely audible whisper that cut through the silence like a blade, she said, "He tried to kill me." A stunned stillness overtook the room. The groom froze, his face draining of all color as the shock of her words sank in. What the bride had swallowed, her body still weak, her hands trembling, and the hoarseness in her voice from last night, as if she had said, "Broken my drink. He put something in my drink," sent shockwaves through the church, and chaos erupted as her brother surged forward, his expression transforming to rage, while guests murmured in disbelief. The groom shook his head violently, his voice cracking with panic. No, Emily, I would never." But Father Michael's gaze was no longer fixed on him. Instead, it was on the paramedics and the police officer who had just arrived. This was no longer just a medical emergency. It was something much darker. The church had become a storm of voices, frantic movement, and shattered illusions. The weight of the bride's words crashed over the congregation like an unrelenting wave, drowning out the murmurs of prayer and well wishes that had once filled the sacred space. Father Michael had seen many things in his years, moments of joy, of sorrow, of deep reflection, but never had he stood at an altar where a bride, moments from marriage, accused the man she was meant to vow her life to of trying to take it away. The echoes of her accusation resonated far more heavily than the hushed gasps and whispers that followed them. The groom, still kneeling beside her, appeared frozen, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and desperation, his lips moving but no words coming out. Then, as if a dam had broken, protest poured out. "No, no. Emily, this isn't right. You're confused. You're sick. You don't know what you're saying." His trembling hands reached for her, but she flinched, pressing herself against the cold stone of the church floor. Her brother had crossed the aisle in a heartbeat, his towering form casting a long shadow over the groom, his hands clenched at his sides, his muscles coiled tightly, barely holding back the rage radiating from him like a tangible force. His voice, low and taut, finally demanded, "What did you do to her?" The groom turned, blinking rapidly, shaking his head in disbelief. I didn't. You drugged her." The brother's voice came not as a question, but as a verdict, his hands twitching as if fighting the urge to grab the groom and demand the truth by force. The groom's voice cracked raw and high with panic. "I didn't. I would never do that. She doesn't know what she's saying." Meanwhile, the paramedics finished securing the four, the antidote already coursing through Emily's veins. One of them, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, checked the readings on a small monitor, stabilizing her while muttering to her colleague, her voice tight, her gaze flickering over Emily's arms as her jaw set at the sight of the faint bruises from the injection sites. She exchanged a glance with the officer who had been watching the scene unfold with a scrutinizing stare. Father Michael stepped forward, his presence quiet but commanding. "I think we need to let the professionals do their job," he said, his voice level but firm. The officer moved in, gesturing for space. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away while we speak to her." The groom's breath hitched as he protested. No, I need to talk to her, I need to—" But the officer's tone left no room for argument. With visible effort, the groom forced himself to his feet, stumbling slightly as he moved away from Emily. He turned, searching the crowd, as if expecting someone to confirm that this was all some kind of mistake, but no one did. The guests whispered, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. The beautiful wedding they had come to witness had unraveled into something grotesque. The mother of the groom pressed a hand to her mouth, her face drained of color, while his father stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that his muscles twitched. Emily stirred, her fingers weakly gripping the edge of the altar cloth, her head swimming with a dull ache pressing behind her eyes. She blinked, her vision blurry, but clearing the oxygen mask felt like a lifeline, pulling her back from the suffocating darkness on the edge of which she had teetered. She turned her gaze toward her brother, remembering last night, the glass of wine, the heaviness in her limbs, the sluggishness that had overcome her before darkness swallowed her whole. As if reading her thoughts, her brother crouched beside her, his fingers curling over her forearm to ground her, his eyes searching hers as he softly said, "Emily, do you remember?" A shiver crawled up her spine as jagged memories pieced together like a broken mirror. She had been drinking, they had been celebrating, but she hadn't had that much. Just a single glass, a single glass. She swallowed, her voice still hoarse, but carrying certainty as she replied, "It was my drink." A ripple of tension spread through the church as the officer's attention sharpened and he asked, "What do you mean?" Emily's breath hitched. "Last night, someone put something in my drink." She turned her gaze toward the groom, her expression wavering between disbelief and something deeper, something that looked like betrayal. The groom took a step forward, his hands raised as if pleading, "Emily, please think. You were drinking with my family. We all had the same wine. If something was in it, we would have known, but her voice, though still weak, cut through his words. "You gave it to me." The church fell deathly silent. The officer then said in an unreadable tone, "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." The groom's face twisted in desperation as the officer's firm stance brooked no argument. His father stepped forward, exclaiming, "This is ridiculous. My son is not a criminal. Nobody is under arrest." Yet the officer replied evenly, "We have enough reason to investigate." For a long moment the groom stood there, his breathing heavy, his entire world unraveling around him, until something in him snapped. At the edge of the pews a figure was slipping toward the back of the church, trying to move unnoticed. Tyler, the best man. Father Michael saw him just as Emily inhaled sharply, a sudden jolt of recognition lighting in her eyes. She recalled that Tyler had handed her the wine the previous night, the wine that the groom had not given her. Before she could form the words, before the thought could fully solidify in her mind. In a single stunned second, Tyler bolted, and then the officer bellowed, "Stop him!" Tyler shoved past the guests, knocking over chairs in his desperate attempt to flee. He nearly made it, but Father Michael moved faster than anyone expected, his hands gripping a heavy brass candle holder from the altar which he hurled forward without hesitation. It struck Tyler's leg just as he reached the doors, and with a strangled yell, Tyler stumbled, his foot catching against the uneven stone step, sending him crashing forward and slamming into the wooden doors with enough force to rattle the stained glass. In seconds the officer was upon him, yanking his arms behind his back and locking the handcuffs around his wrists. Tyler struggled, his breath ragged, but it was over. Her brother exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping as if the tension that had gripped him for the last 24 hours had suddenly released. The church was still heavy with the weight of the truth, settling over everyone like dust after a storm. Father Michael met Emily's gaze, her lips parted, her fragile voice delivering the final blow. "It wasn't him," she whispered, her eyes locked on the man who had once been her fiancé. "It was Tyler." And just like that, everything changed again. The weight of Emily's words settled over the church like a suffocating fog. The murmurs of disbelief, the whispers of confusion, and the distant, uneven breaths of the groom all seemed to slow, as if time itself had stilled in the wake of a revelation. Tyler, now pinned to the floor beneath the officer's firm grip, ceased his struggles. His breath was heavy and ragged, his body tense, his muscles still coiled as though he still considered the possibility of escape. But there was nowhere left to run. The groom, who had been reeling only moments ago from the accusation Emily had thrown at him, turned toward his supposed best friend with a look of disbelief so raw it bordered on heartbreak. The realization crept over him like the first shadow of a coming storm. He finally breathed in a barely audible whisper. Tyler remained silent, his head bowed, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he processed his failure. Emily, still weak and trembling from the aftershocks of whatever had been in her system, clutched her brother's arm as memories grew clearer, no longer shrouded in the haze of unconsciousness, but vivid as if she were back on that rainy night, standing in her doorway with bags packed and her heart pounding against her ribs. She remembered how, after that single glass of wine from Tyler, darkness had overtaken her. Now, with the pieces falling into place, she could see it all. Tyler had handed her the wine, had watched her drink it, had smiled and said something charming and casual, as if nothing were amiss. The officer then yanked Tyler to his feet, the cuffs clinking as they bit into his skin. Though his expression remained unreadable, a flicker in his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. Mark's voice broke through, laden with disbelief and a dangerous edge. "Why would you do this, Tyler?" Tyler lifted his head, his lips curling into a bitter, remorseful smirk as he said, "You were never supposed to marry her." His words fell like a hammer, shattering the fragile remnants of any illusion that still clung to the room. Emily inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her brother's sleeve, as the groom's face twisted in confusion, struggling to process what he had just heard. The guests, still standing in shocked silence, barely dared to breathe. Father Michael stepped forward, his quiet intensity born of a lifetime of witnessing human darkness, and said, "Tyler, who told you about Emily's past?" Tyler hesitated for a second. Father Michael narrowed his eyes and asked, "Who gave you that information?" Tyler exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. "A man called me," he admitted. "He said he had proof, said she was dangerous, and sent me files and photos. Told me I had to stop the wedding before it was too late." Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine as Father Michael's voice grew grave. "Did this man ever give you his name?" Tyler swallowed, and after a long pause his voice came out barely above a whisper. Daniel Parker." Mark's eyes widened, his hands unclenched and his fingers trembling slightly as Father Michael's expression darkened. Emily felt cold. "Daniel Parker is alive, and he is watching," Tyler stated, as if his words could summon him. The heavy church doors creaked open, and a tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. Panicked whispers rose from the crowd as Emily recognized the face she had spent 5 years fleeing. Daniel Parker stepped forward with a slow, sinister smile, and in that moment Emily knew she hadn't run far enough. The heavy wooden doors groaned on their hinges as they swung open and the afternoon light poured into the church, casting Daniel Parker's figure into a sharp silhouette. The murmurs of the guests fell away, replaced by an eerie, stunned silence, and even the air in the room grew thick and heavy with unspoken danger. Every muscle in Emily's body tensed. Her instincts screamed at her to run, yet she could not move or look away. Daniel Parker's dark eyes swept over the scene as the slow, deliberate click of his polished shoes on the stone floor rang out. His posture relaxed and casual, as if he were entering a room full of old friends rather than the wedding of the woman who had once fled from him. In that long, unbearable moment, Tyler's body went rigid, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. A realization flickered across his face, followed by something that looked very much like horror, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Mark took a step back, his gaze darting between Emily and the man who had just entered. His face was unreadable, but Emily could see the storm behind his eyes, the way his fingers twitched at his sides, as if he didn't know whether to reach for her or pull away. Father Michael remained still, his sharp gaze taking in every detail of Daniel Parker as he walked through the church doors, a sight that even the old priest, who had seen so much in his lifetime, found unsettling. The police officer who had arrested Tyler shifted his stance, his hand moving subtly toward his holster, not quite drawing his weapon yet, but the tension in his body said he was ready. Daniel Parker smiled wider and, in a voice smooth as glass carrying through the silent church, said, "I seem to have arrived at an interesting moment." Emily's stomach twisted at that familiar yet rotten voice, a voice that had once whispered promises of love in the dark, only now to twist them into cruelty. Summoning her strength, she managed to say, "You're dead." But Daniel Parker laughed richly, sending a shiver down her spine. "Clearly not," he replied while spreading his arms slightly, though perhaps she should have felt flattered. She could feel the weight of everyone's questions pressing down on her like a crushing force. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, I didn't kill you," she managed, and Daniel Parker's smile never wavered, though his eyes darkened as Tyler, still standing beside the officer, looked as if he had just been punched in the stomach. "You," Tyler breathed, his voice filled with disbelief and dawning horror that sent another wave of nausea rolling through Emily. Daniel Parker turned to Tyler, his tone tinged with amused disdain as he said, "Ah, Tyler, I must say I'm impressed. You followed instructions well. You set me up, didn't you?" Tyler's face went pale, his hands clenched into fists as he struggled with the weight of his actions. "You told me she was dangerous, that she was a liar," his voice faltered. "You used me," he admitted softly. Daniel Parker chuckled. "Oh, Tyler, you were so eager to be the hero, so desperate to protect your dear friend Mark from the big bad woman with secrets. Did you ever stop to ask if maybe you were being played?" Tyler could only remain silent, his shoulders slumping as Emily watched his defeat with a flicker of pity. Mark, still trembling, finally turned back to her and said in a quiet, strained voice, You told me you didn't know what happened to him. I thought he was gone. I thought he was dead. Emily, her nails biting into her palms, demanded, "How are you here?" Daniel Parker sighed theatrically. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting you to run that night. I really thought we could work things out, but then you made things difficult." Emily's blood ran cold as Father Michael stepped closer, positioning himself between her and Daniel Parker, his voice calm, yet steely. "You should leave." Daniel Parker lifted a brow and replied, "Oh, but I just got here, and besides, we still have unfinished business." The officer then ordered sharply, "Sir, you need to step back." Daniel Parker turned his gaze on him, his expression utterly unconcerned. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket. The reaction was instantaneous. The officer's hand went to his gun, a guest screamed, and Mark rushed forward, shielding Emily with his body. A deafening shot rang out in the enclosed church. Wood splintered to her left as the officer lunged, tackling Daniel Parker to the ground. Chaos erupted. Guests scrambled and screamed, and Tyler pressed himself against a pew, his face frozen in horror. Emily's breath came in gasps as her mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. Daniel Parker thrashed against the officer's hold, snarling as the metal cuffs snapped around his wrist. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" he spat, locking eyes with Emily. "You'll never be free of me." Emily's hands trembled as Mark, his face tight with concern, asked, "Are you okay?" But her voice failed her. Even as Daniel Parker was dragged toward the door, his presence clinging to her like a shadow, she knew this wasn't over. It would never be over unless she made it so. Then, as the officers escorted Daniel Parker out of the church, something shifted inside Emily for the first time in years. She was no longer afraid. She was angry, and she wasn't running anymore. The echoes of Daniel Parker's threats lingered in the air long after he was gone, his venomous words clinging to the walls like an indelible stain. The guests remained frozen in place, whispering and staring in a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. Emily stood in the center of it all, her uneven breath and trembling fingers betraying the storm within her. For years she had run from Daniel Parker's shadow, shaping herself into someone new and believing that the past could be buried if she only ran far enough. But now it had caught up with her. In that moment, with her heart pounding and her eyes filled with determination, she realized that she was free from the fear that had defined her life. Her brother was the first to move, stepping toward her with cautious determination, his eyes searching her face for any lingering traces of the woman who had collapsed at the altar. When he reached her, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said softly, "He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore." For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to believe it. Behind them, the remaining guests slowly filed out of the once grand church, now reduced to hushed conversations and stolen glances. The flowers, the decorations, the carefully planned details all seemed like remnants of another life. Another version of this day that had never come to pass. Emily looked down at her dress. The delicate fabric now felt foreign against her skin, as if it had belonged to someone else, the woman she had pretended to be. But she knew she was no longer that woman. With her brother by her side, her constant anchor, she softly said, "Let's go home," and together they walked out into the fading afternoon light. The vast, endless sky stretched above them, far beyond the limits of the town and the weight of the past, and for the first time in years, Emily wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't running. She was free. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next video, and check out others you might have missed. See you next time.